In 1995, the film Judge Dredd hit theaters all across the country. It was based on the popular comic book character and starred Sylvester Stallone in the lead role. It took place in a harsh future where megacities have arisen as humanity's only refuge against the radioactive desert that covers the area outside of them. Megacity 1, what's left of the eastern United States of America, is an overpopulated and crime-ridden cesspool, with judges being its only police force. Judges are so named because they can deliver punishments and even executions on the spot as needed. As you can probably guess, this system becomes corrupt, and so the main story of the film begins. Acclaim, no stranger to the art of scooping up movie tie-ins for its games, grabbed this one as well, putting Probe Entertainment on the project. Believe it or not, it released right on time for the film, a run-and-gun with over a dozen levels. Did this one fall down the well of garbage licensed properties, or did Acclaim publish something worth your time? Let's find out. The future setting of Judge Dredd is a mess. Not only must you deal with a plot that frames you for a murder you didn't commit, but you also must deal with the corrupt former judge that intends to take control of the city. The game here even goes beyond the plot of the film and adds in Death and his army of dark judges. These spirits can take control of both the living and the dead, turning anyone against you. Death believes that all humanity is guilty and intends to execute every living soul in Mega City. Should Death and his minions get their hands on the technology to bring their bodies into the physical world, everyone is surely doomed. As I mentioned earlier, Judge Dredd the video game is a run-and-gun with light exploration and puzzle elements. The base play mechanics give you the ability to walk, run, jump, crouch, crawl, climb ladders, and hang from certain obstacles. Combat presents both close quarters melee options, as well as gunplay via your Lawgiver pistol. This all-purpose weapon comes with a slew of ammo types to employ. There is a weak standard shot that is unlimited, heat-seeking missiles that track down your foe, rubber-tipped shells that bounce off hard surfaces and stun your target, incendiary ammo explodes on contact, armor-piercing ammo is perfect for robots, there's both a standard grenade and a long-range grenade launcher. The double whammy is a dual version of the heat-seeking missile. Finally, you have a plastic-like bubble ammo that can contain dark judges and burst after a few seconds. You can cycle through your ammo in real time and use it whenever you need it, as long as you still have shells. Gunplay allows you to shoot at all angles around you, and you can also do that while you're on a ladder. This allows you an impressive amount of options to come at your enemies. Should an enemy surrender, you can arrest them for an increased score and the possibility of bonus items. Ammo isn't the only thing in the field you can procure. There's also life replenishment, extra lives, force fields, and even an anti-gravity belt for limited flight. There are also certain levels that require specific items to complete, such as the Book of Law or flares to defeat a specific boss. You can also collect password discs so you can return to that stage, as well as money and contraband to increase your score. The top of the screen is your heads-up display. From left to right, it displays an information panel for the completion of your objectives of the current stage, the number of lives you have left, your ammo type and number, the score, and finally a life bar below it. As you can imagine, Judge Dredd is a one-player title. The visuals of Judge Dredd have a solid variety of locations. There are buildings to traverse, prisons to assault, sewers to explore, wastelands to suffer, caves to get lost in, labs to loot, a great Statue of Liberty set piece, a vehicle-based shooter level, and even the realm that Death himself inhabits. Needless to say, there's enough here to keep you busy for quite some time. The details in these futuristic locations is impressive, and each stage typically features a few layers of parallax scrolling. The 16 megabits of ROM here also has some fairly nice looking animation for the main character and his enemies. Being a later release title and having to compete with games focusing on much better animation than in previous years, Probe really did an impressive job in this regard. And while I would definitely say that Judge Dredd is a good looking game, it repeats a lot of assets, sometimes across numerous stages. Every so often you have an area that is suspiciously lacking any real pizzazz, like the developers didn't really try very hard to make anything stand out. These areas have no great color use, no standout features in the background, nor any set pieces to explain their simplicity. We could have been given some extra layers of parallax in the backgrounds or something to liven these wastelands up a bit. It's a real shame because had the designers gone a little further, this was close to being a standout title visually for the platform. Sadly, the Genesis version suffers a real downgrade compared to its Super Nintendo counterpart. The Super Nintendo has special effects, animation, stage details, and many more things completely missing in the Sega version. Using the first stage as an example, it's raining in the Super Nintendo version, while you get nothing in the Genesis release. Both games are 16 megabits, so this is somewhat irritating to see the omissions. The sound design is a mixed bag of awesome twang and anemic blips and bloops. When a stage theme hits hard, it's incredible. When it's weak, it's very underpowered and completely forgettable. I'm going to give you two examples of each so you can hear the difference. I've mentioned a few times that Probe Entertainment developed Judge Dredd, and the Genesis port here is definitely done by their B team. The Super Nintendo edition, released at the same time, and the Sega version has a number of differences that really hurt it beyond the previously mentioned visuals. On the Genesis, the core gameplay suffers different physics when jumping, which changes how the entire game feels. On the Super Nintendo, jumps were much more forgiving, thanks to feeling more floaty with additional airtime, while the Genesis has a much harsher level of gravity. I was also disappointed with the melee combat in the Genesis version. In the Super Nintendo release, you had a single melee combat button, just like the Genesis, but in the former, you could choose your attack with a directional pad input. For example, up and A was the headbutt. Hit the pad towards the enemy in A, and you get a punch. If you wanted a kick, the A alone activated it, which also worked as a pretty effective jump kick. In the Genesis, the control over the melee combat is completely absent. The melee button randomly chooses your attack for you, and the jump kick is missing entirely. You will also notice that the way you arrest enemies has changed some. On the Genesis, you have to be right in front of the enemy sprite to activate it, which comes with no animation indicating you are trying, and you get a much shorter window of opportunity to pull it off. Unless you are already there at the enemy, there is little use to even try it on the Genesis. On the Super Nintendo, when the enemy submits, you get plenty of time and an animation showing you are attempting to actually arrest them. If you can believe it, you also can't crawl on uneven surfaces the same way you can on the Super Nintendo, which can get you hit if you are trying to duck enemy fire. All of that really pisses me off, because otherwise, Judge Dredd is a very playable run and gun. Outside of some shallow and stupidly hard boss fights, each of the stages are huge and have multiple missions to complete, something your typical game in this genre doesn't have. It's also a solid challenge that forces you to play smart. Some enemies aren't worth arresting, and a password isn't an easy thing to come by. If you want it, you gotta earn it by finding the disc. The sound and visuals are also very close to the Super Nintendo edition in overall quality. You get a bit more color on Nintendo's console and some additional effects, but the Genesis version holds its own and looks and sounds great despite its shortcomings. The question really boils down to this: do the changes to the gameplay in the Genesis release ruin it? No, it doesn't ruin it, but these changes are irritating if you have access to both versions. There was no reason for these differences since the Genesis Judge Dredd supports the 6-button arcade pad and had more than enough buttons to pull everything off. The changes to the jump are baffling to say the least, and can only be a result of a time crunch given the Genesis version the short end of the stick. You can still have fun with this and the design remains appealing, but when it comes to a choice, the Super Nintendo is easily the best way to play it. Gaming magazines of the day were mostly positive about Judge Dredd's quality. They almost always gave the edge to the Super Nintendo, but the consensus rarely departed above average ratings. The only somewhat negative review I found was in the US publication called Video Games, which wasn't too keen on its similarity to other games in the genre. For those of you looking for a portable version to play, there are both Game Gear and Game Boy versions of this. They are loosely based on the console editions, and while the Game Boy release is ugly as sin, the Game Gear does the IP justice and is quite playable. Hell, I'd even call it a hidden gem you'd never expect to control as decently as it does. Hilariously, the gameplay in the Game Gear version feels more like the Super Nintendo edition when it comes to jumping. All the Judge Dredd versions must have underperformed something terrible for acclaim, because they had big plans for the IP that never actually panned out. This was in development for the Sega 32X, the Sega Saturn, and the Atari Jaguar CD. None of those platforms ever received it. I can say this: if you enjoyed other run and gun titles like Demolition Man or the Terminator for the Sega CD, this feels very similar and may well be worth visiting. A few complaints aside, it holds up nicely in pretty much every area, though I do recommend playing both the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions to make sure you aren't missing something important to you. Sylvester Stallone vehicles weren't always winners, but this one is well worth a spin if you appreciate the genre. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.